Before Dungeons & Dragons, before Greyhawk, and even before Blackmore, there was a game called Braunstein, and I had a chance to play this game with its creator at DaveCon just a couple days ago. I'm going to talk about those experiences and how some of the concepts from Braunstein ended up impacting the future of role-playing games. Today on Daddy Rolled a One. Please help support More Daddy Rolled a One by buying a t-shirt, hoodie, mug, poster, notebook, or other items from my shop. Thank you. Hello there, and welcome back. I'm Martin, and this is another video in my series on the history of early tabletop role-playing games, including Dungeons & Dragons. Today's video, I'm going to be talking about my experiences that I had at DaveCon 2024, which was held just a few days ago, April 26th through 28th. Today's April 30th. And the people that I got to meet while I was there, but most specifically talking about my experiences playing in the game of Braunstein, run by Dave Wesely. Now, Dave Wesely was the person that created Braunstein, and he's one of the three Daves that is being honored at this convention, the other two being Dave Arneson and also Dave McGarry. Now, if you've watched the channel in the past, you have probably heard me multiple times mispronounce Dave Wesely's and Dave McGarry's last names, but I actually got to meet both of them in person and chat with them individually and talk to them about their experiences that were happening at the time when Braunstein and later Blackmore were created. So apologies for having mispronounced their names in the past, but moving forward, that won't be an issue because I will definitely remember how to pronounce them. Also, you've probably heard me mispronounce the name Braunstein. I didn't really mispronounce. I just wasn't sure whether it was Braunstein or Braunstein. It is very clear that it is Braunstein, or a couple of people said Braunstein, which I think both of them are technically correct. But the key part is that the last part of that is pronounced Stein because it is like having a brown stein, like an ale mug. So I'm going to be talking about that game. And then in future videos, I'm going to have a couple other things where I talk about having played in the first Blackmore game. This one was run by Bill Hoyt, who was there at the time. Obviously, Dave Arneson is unfortunately no longer with us and can't run it. But Bill Hoyt was there, and he actually has a lot of the pieces of original terrain and troops that Dave Arneson used in that game about over 50 years ago. And so we were actually being able to hold artifacts from that time period of this game that is so fundamental into creating the hobby that we now all enjoy. And then I got to sit down and talk with people like Dave McGarry, Dave Wesely, but also Mike Carr, and chat with them about things like where hit points and armor class and experience points and leveling came from, but also how those original founders, like how much were they influenced by things like Tolkien or science fiction. I talked with them about the first cleric, the first thief, and just so much more. Now, a lot of these topics I've touched on before, but I'm going to be making a video about my actual interviews with these people. And if you are interested in that kind of thing, please make sure to like and subscribe to the channel so that you don't miss it. And also, if you could share it with your friends, I would really appreciate it because it helps grow the channel. Now, as far as being at the convention, it was just a blast. They're already planning on having it next year, April of 2025, I think the last weekend of April. So if you are in the Minneapolis area, or if you have the means of traveling there, I highly recommend it because you actually get to interact again with these people who are so fundamental to the foundation of our hobby. And I would suggest that you take advantage of that while you can, if it is something that interests you, the history of the game, which as it does me. So I was so fortunate to meet so many other YouTubers out there, people like Professor Dungeon Master from Dungeon Craft and Baron DeRop from Dungeon Masterpiece and Justin Alexander from Alexandrian. And just as a highlight for me, I actually had a chance to sit down with them. We had a bite to eat at one point. We had a couple of beers, and they gave me advice for my channel, which was just amazing, but also just chatting with them about gaming and just about life. And that was so awesome. So these are three channels that I obviously recommend that you check out, but also just letting people know that like these people were so nice and welcoming, and I'm just a tiny blip of a small channel, and they couldn't have been nicer, trying to again, giving me advice, but also telling people to check out my channel. And I thought that was super awesome. And then the other thing that was really great was I got to meet so many of you. So I had mentioned a few times that I was going to be there, and I was quite honestly blown away by how many people came up to me and said hi and how much they enjoy my channel. And so many people that said, like, I would be talking and they'd say, I recognize that voice. There's a guy that came after me and said, I heard you talking or asking a question during one of the seminars. And he said, I had to come up to you afterwards and say hi and how much I enjoy your channel. And I really didn't expect that. I thought maybe there'd be a couple of people there that knew me, but it was way more than I was expecting. And I was so honored that you all did take the chance to come up and talk to me, because I really, really enjoyed it. So thank you so much for doing that and for your support of the channel. And I haven't really attended a lot of conventions in the past, but having had so much fun at this one, I'm hoping to be able to do that a little bit more. And I would love to be able to see you all and meet new people as well in the future. All right. So with that said, let's start talking about my experience playing Braunstein. So just to give you a super quick overview of where Braunstein comes from, I think a lot of you that watch my channel probably know, but I know that there's also a lot of people out there that just don't follow this stuff as closely, which is fine, but it's important to understand why I was so excited to play in this game. So you have to go back to the 1960s. And again, I'm not going to hit all of this very much in detail, and I would highly encourage you to watch. There's a documentary called The Secrets of Blackmore. I've talked about it before, but it will help you connect the dots between these early war games to the game of Blackmore, which then was what was responsible for creating the game of Dungeons and Dragons. But in any event, in Minneapolis, there's a wargaming group that is founded in the early 1960s, 1963, and Dave Wesely is one of them. And what you have to remember about these guys that are playing war games back then is, unlike today, where you go to the store and buy a boxed game and it has all the things that you need, the rules and the maps and the terrain and the figures and all that stuff, and you put it out on the table and you play the game. Back then, they had the figures. They were buying figures, they were painting the figures, and that was one of the big parts of this pastime, was amassing these armies and painting them to almost kind of like having bragging rights. But they were sort of creating the rules that they needed along the way. There weren't necessarily these definitive published rules for how to play these games. And so these war gamers would come together, and it was like a think tank where they would figure out how they wanted to make the rules so that they could do the things in these games that they wanted to do. And Dave Wesely is one of these people, and he's trying to figure out how to make the games better. And he starts digging around to try to figure things out of where can he go, what sources can he rely on to help him figure out how to make these games run in the way that he wants them to run. And he is at a small university in Minneapolis. I forget the specific name, but he ends up going to the library at the University of Minneapolis in Minnesota, because he said that the library there was just much bigger than the one at the college that he was at. And he ends up finding this book called Strategos by Totten. And it is a 324 page, just a beast of a book that was written as a sort of revision of a game that was created by the Prussian military in the very early 1800s, I think roughly around 1820, called Kriegsspiel. And that game was specifically created to help train Prussian military, especially during times when they were not in the middle of warfare, not in combat. And it was a training exercise. It was a way of training their troops to make them think more strategically and be better soldiers, better troops. And one of the things that came out of this is that there was a battle that it was very clearly kind of decided ahead of time that the French army had the upper hand. They were the most advanced army at the time, and they were fighting the Prussians. And the Prussian army ended up defeating the French army, and nobody had expected that. And one of the reasons that people kind of say that why that happened was because the Prussian army had been training you playing this game of Kriegsspiel. That's one of the explanations. Okay. So anyway, 60 years later, a person in the United States military created this game Strategos based on Kriegsspiel, because Kriegsspiel is based on obviously the Prussian military and the environment, the terrain that they're fighting in, but also the weaponry of the time. And 60 years later, there's been huge advances in weaponry. So you're in the 1880s, you're post-Civil War, you're post-smoothbore muskets. There was already siege warfare happening at Petersburg in Virginia toward the end of the Civil War, which was one of the first times that was sort of happening, where you're digging trenches. And, siege warfare obviously had happened before, but doing siege warfare in this specific way that it was done with again, digging trenches and surrounding the city like that with the kind of weapons that they had. So Strategos was written to introduce those concepts into these war games. Now, this is, again, this huge book that is not very practical for playing a friendly war game with friends. So Dave Wesely parses through this book and is able to condense it down to fewer than 20 pages. And he creates this game called Strategos-N. Now, I very kind of embarrassingly now, but I raised my hand during the session to ask Dave Wesely, why was it called Strategos-N? And about 5 people kind of looked at me in the chat, because it's Napoleonics. It's N for Napoleonics. And the thing is, I actually did already know that. I had just completely forgotten. And my face, I'm sure, turned red. But in any event, this background that I'm giving you, this is stuff that Dave Wesely talked about as we began to play our game of Braunstein. So he sat in front of the room and he was telling the history of how he kind of came to create this game. And it actually took quite a long time, but it was really interesting. Now, again, a lot of this history that he told us was covered in Secrets of Blackmoor that many of us had already seen, but it was still great to kind of hear it in person from the guy who created the game. So he creates Strategos-N, and they begin playing. He begins to want to dabble with the concepts of, like, how can he push this farther and do new things with that. Now, one of the things that Strategos introduces that Dave Wesely was really intrigued with was the idea of the referee. And this is such an important part of history for role-playing games, because the referee, or now we would call it a dungeon master if you play D&D, or a games master, some people call it a storyteller, whatever word or term you want to use, it comes from this idea that Dave Wesely took from Strategos to insert a referee, a neutral arbiter who could make decisions between players. And it's that crucial piece that he added to the game, and then some other elements that came along, and I'm going to talk about those. But that's what makes Braunstein the first role-playing game. So back in the day, because of all the marketing stuff that was coming out from TSR and Gary Gygax and all the self-promotion, there was this idea that Dungeons and Dragons was the first role-playing game. It's the first game that eventually is where they market it as, they call it a role-playing game. Okay, I'll just put it that way. Braunstein was not called a role-playing game, but neither was D&D when it was first published. It was called, Fantastic Medieval War Games Campaigns. So role-playing as a term to describe what these things were doing didn't come along until later, or at least, the term was there, but it wasn't added to these games until later. But if we look at it now historically, knowing what we know and being able to get all this information that had kind of been lost for decades, Dave Wesely kind of got away from running war games for about, I think it was almost 40 years after he first started. And so that part of the history was kind of lost. And that's why a lot of people just weren't aware of these games, but it's starting to become more and more prevalent that people are understanding that Braunstein is a role-playing game. And because of it, that's why we have Dungeons and Dragons. But he talks about how he used this concept of the referee. There was a few other books that he read that helped him kind of figure out the type of game that he wanted to run. One of them was a game actually about, or a book about, conflict resolution between labor and management. And the idea of that is that you have winners on both sides. So the idea of that kind of conflict resolution, you don't want to have management getting the upper hand because labor is going to be upset. And you don't want labor getting the upper hand because management is going to be upset. You want both sides to feel that they got what they wanted, or, as close as they could get to what they wanted. So it's a win-win. And it was almost a mistake that Dave Wesely read that book, because originally, because of the title of the book, and I forget the title right now, I'll put it up here on the screen, but because the title was what it was, he thought it was about game theory. And it turned out it wasn't, but it helped him understand that he could run a game where there was technically no winner, that everyone playing was a winner. So what they would call a zero sum. Okay. So that was such a unique concept to add to this thing. And that's where we get to the role playing. Okay. So he explained that history, and it took almost an hour. Okay. And then he got into talking about the history of this fictional town called Braunstein that he had created for the game to take place in. Now, there is an actual town called Braunstein in Germany, but Dave Wesely was not aware of that when he created this. He found that out much later. So his Braunstein has no relation to the original town, but I'm just pointing that out in case anyone sees it on a map. He's not talking about the town you can see on the map. This is a fictional town that he says is close to the border between Prussia and France. It's 1797. It's post-American Revolution. It's, the French Revolution is going on. And so the concepts of sort of revolting against the state, the revolution, and the people coming to power and taking the power away from the people in power is a big deal that's happening right now. So he sets the stage for the game, and there's a map that he's put a huge table, and he's got a map, and he's showing us where the university is and where the keep is and all these kinds of things. Now, interestingly, at least from the way that my character was involved and played the game, and I think most of the people that I interacted with during the game, the map and where the different things were on the map were sort of secondary or almost irrelevant to playing the game. So, but he does have it. Now, my character came with a map, and I'm going to tell you about my character in a second, but it really almost didn't come up. So you're getting away from these war games that they were playing that were very specific of where things were on the map and moving things around into this much more amorphous sort of vague situation where the relationships and the interactions between the characters, or the players, I should say, is much more important than where their people are, on the board. Now, I will point out here that Dave Wesely does run Braunstein at other conventions. He just recently ran it at GaryCon a few months ago. And the game that he runs, so he has a few different versions of Braunstein. The most famous ones are 1 and 4. At a certain point, he ran Braunstein, like a second time, Braunstein 2 and 3, in which he tried to regain a little bit of control to the game. I'm going to tell you why he did that. But those two weren't really successful. And so he's sort of returned back to the original formula in Braunstein 4, although it took place in a different setting. But he runs 1 and 4 most often. But the thing is, they're the same every time in terms of the characters or the roles, which is more specific, the role that the players play. And those roles have goals given to them. And he doesn't really update them because you want that original experience. The reason I'm pointing this out is that if you want to play Braunstein and you want to be surprised and not know some of these secrets, I am going to be talking very briefly about some of the things that happen during the game. And if you want to go into it fresh, I guess don't watch this and come back and watch it after you've had a chance to play. But I do hope you stick around because I think you'll find it very interesting how we get from this to Dungeons and Dragons, which is what this video is really about. So one of the things that he talks about, so he sets the stage and he says that this town is there and the French Revolution's happening and there's, French troops on the border and they're getting close and maybe they're going to invade, and you have student revolutionaries that are happening. The younger kids are sort of rising up, and all of this, he's making all this up, all these characters and roles and stuff that he's making. So he's got this big stack of papers. And so he begins to ask us, like, who wants to be this? Who wants to be, a revolutionary, a student revolutionary, and who wants to be this? And he kind of like throws it out, and people are just jumping on it like really fast, right? And I'm actually not one that normally jumps forward. I usually like to kind of sit back and just watch others see what they're doing. So I was one of the last people that was assigned somebody. So I actually had offered that I wanted to be a student revolutionary. And
he had these red stocking caps to give to everybody who were revolutionaries, so that you could tell like who they were, like these red caps, right? So I got a cap, but then he couldn't find the character that was associated with that person in his stack. So I had to give my cap back to him, and I ended up playing a different student. So all of his characters, very similarly to like when you see how, as an example, Gary Gygax wrote Keep on the Borderlands, where none of the NPCs in that game have names. So there's like the Castellan and the Tavern Keeper and the Banker and the Merchant, all that kind of stuff. In Braunstein, it's very similar. So I'm calling them characters. They're not characters, they're roles. You're playing a role. So they were things like the Chancellor. Now, in this particular case, that was played by Justin Alexander from the Alexandrian. And there was Student A, and he was played by Baron de Ropp, and he was not a revolutionary. And then there was Student F, who was played by Professor Dungeon Master, and he was a revolutionary. And then I was playing Student G. And then there was a banker, and there was a baron, and there were all these different roles that happened. There were two, they're called Landwehr, and there was like the sergeant and the major, and they were sort of the guards. Okay. And there was a priest, and there was a traveling bookseller, and there was a gypsy or Romani character. There was a, his tag just read the French guy. That was his tag. And, there's quite a few others. Okay. So everybody is given a role, and then you read through, and you got some money. Maybe you start with money. I did not start with money, but some people did. And, it was, it was kind of like Monopoly money, that kind of thing. And then it gave you a picture of what your character looked like. And I wish that I'd had the forethought to take pictures of my character. We gave them back after, and I think at the time I was thinking that we were going to get to keep them, and we didn't. At least if we did, I left mine there accidentally. But there was, and he's just printing pictures off the internet, which the same way I do it for my daughter's game. If you've seen my DM notebook before, well, I will find pictures online, usually on Pinterest, that match close to what I'm trying to look for. And so that's what he was doing. So that was your cup. And then you had this write-up that told you your character background in, a few paragraphs, and some characters had more, some had fewer. And then at the end, it gave you your objectives or your goals. These are the things that you're trying to accomplish. So I was Student G. I was not a revolutionary. And my character's background was that I was at a tavern, and there are two taverns in town, and one caters to the revolutionary students and one caters to the more loyalist students. Now, I'm technically a loyalist student, although it didn't really give me too much background as to how loyal I was. But in any event, we were at, I believe, the revolutionary tavern. Now, I don't know why we would have been there, but I think that's where we were. I got a little confused between which tavern was which, to be quite honest. But we were at a tavern, and this all happens before. So this is the background. And a fight has broken out. And mine said between Student A and his bullies. So I know that Student A, which again was Baron de Ropp, I know that technically he's a bully and probably started the fight. However, it didn't say that I saw him start the fight. It just said I saw I saw Student A and his bullies in a fight. And there are other revolutionary students there. And it says the next thing, and I'm just there drinking. So it's very clear. It said my character drinks a lot, which I thought was really funny because I always talk about my drinks at the end of the videos. So it said my character drinks a lot. He was sort of, probably more than a little tipsy. And the next thing he knew, he's got ale dumped over him, and he's soaked. And it seemed to be that my character was not involved in this fight. He was just there drinking, and he got wrapped up to it. And as this fight broke out, the Landwehr come in. They essentially arrest and detain everybody. And I had 50, I forget what the unit of currency was that we were using, but essentially $50, let's say. I had $50 on me, and it was taken. And so I don't have any more. So my goals were to get out of jail, to make sure that I didn't get kicked out of the university. So that was a huge goal of mine. I did not want to get kicked out. and to make sure that someone else was blamed for the riot. So I was supposed to be out for myself and making sure that someone else was blamed and it didn't fall on me. And then lastly, to get my money back. And so in my character's thing, it was pretty clear that it was one of these two landware that had probably taken my money, but it didn't say which one. So basically, we all got one of those. He told us to read it. And then he started the session out, Dave Wesely, that is, started it out by saying, okay, if you're a revolutionary student, you're in jail, stand over there. And if you are another student that's not a revolutionary, you're also in jail, but you're in a different cell, go over there. And so we all stood there in these little corners. And they said, okay, you can start playing now. And that was the game. There were no miniatures. There were no armies. There were no turns necessarily. And it's interesting why there are no turns. So you have to remember that this is coming out of a war game. Dave Wesely originally intended this to have turns because the way that he had intended to run this game was to call people in one by one. And he was sitting like in a different room or behind us, in an area that was separate from the players. I think it was a different room of when they started playing. And so he would call players in one by one and ask them, what are you doing and where are you? So he would ask them, like, what part of town are you in? And then get them to say what they were doing. And then they would leave and the next person would come in. Okay. And so I think in his mind, he was going to create those to have turns, like, call people in one at a time, and then they'd go out and then he'd figure out what was going on. And then he'd call them in again. And that would go like in an order. Okay, well, a couple of things happened. So one thing that happened was way more people showed up than he was anticipating the first time that he ran this. So when he was running this back in the late 1960s, I think he was counting on about 6 players, if I'm remembering that correctly, but about 20 players showed up. So he was having to create characters or roles on the fly to give to people because he hadn't anticipated that many people. So I get the impression that my student G was probably not one of the original roles that he had created or intended, and he had to come up with it quickly way back in the day when all those people showed up. And so as a consequence, my background and my role was not as robust as somebody like the Chancellor or the Landwehr people or the Baron, where, they had, I want to say, bigger roles. And it's not really that the role itself was bigger. It's just that there was more to it. There was more context for what they were doing. There was a lot more machinations there were secret things, like the Baron had a secret son, or maybe he had 2, and the banker knew who it was, but he was the only other person that knew besides the Baron. And there was, and the tavern owner was involved because she was this guy's mom. And so there was this whole thing going on that was very soap opera like. And all my character was doing was out on the outside, like trying to get my money back. Don't get kicked out of school, get out of jail. Right. So, but we started playing like this. And so what happened was, I was talking about the turns. In the original game, the players started talking to themselves, between themselves, when they were not with Dave Wesely. And for whatever reason, he hadn't anticipated that was going to happen. And so these players started making these backroom deals. Like, I know, oh, you're so-and-so, I need to talk to you. Or like, I've heard that such and such was doing this, like pass the word on, like whatever it was. And that was happening. And Dave Wesely was not privy to that because he was in another room. So he didn't understand that this was happening. So then he would start calling people in and asking them what they want to do. And they were giving him instructions of what their character was doing, their role was doing, based on these conversations that they were having in the other room that Dave Wesely wasn't aware of. And I guess he got really frustrated because he hadn't planned for that, and he thought the game was a disaster. But it turns out, of course, that it wasn't. And the people that were playing that game loved that. So if you've ever played a LARP, this is essentially what it was. I have played LARPs just a couple of times. My friend Tom Donnelly, he's a screenwriter, but he ran one at a convention here in Los Angeles. I think it might have been Strategos-N, but it was a few years ago. And I went not knowing what to expect because I never played a LARP before. And I was just blown away by how much fun it was because it was completely not what I was expecting. And that's sort of what happened with Braunstein. So I didn't know too much of what to expect. I know that Ben Milton recently on Questing Beast did a sort of overview of Braunstein, and I knew that had come out. It turns out that he played it at GaryCon, and I specifically didn't watch his video before I played the game because I didn't want to be influenced by what he was talking about. I wanted to just go in fresh and have no idea what was happening. And I'm glad that happened. I have since watched his video. He had, a different experience than we had. But in the game, so we just started playing, and so there's no turns because you can't really structure that. You have all these different characters that all have their different things written on their sheet or their different roles. And so we just started having conversations with each other. So I'm not going to get into all the details of the game, but at the end of what happened. So first off, I accomplished all 4 of my goals. I got out of jail. I was not blamed for the riot. I made a deal with the Chancellor, played by Justin Alexander. I had a whole conversation with him, telling him how nervous my character, I was. I didn't, I was just there. I wasn't involved in the fight. I just got swept up in it. And I just want to make sure that I don't get lumped in with the wrong crowd because I don't want to get kicked out of university. And he gave me his word that he would not kick me out and that he had authority over the Baron or anybody else who might try to do something. And then I was being, I got thrown under the bus essentially, where one of the landwear guys was going to whip me as a symbol of what not to do. And I felt that I was, it was very clear the revolutionary people were throwing me under the bus. And so I needed to get out of that. And so I started making friends with the landwear people, even though I knew one of them had taken my money, and I was trying to play them against each other because I was trying to figure out which one of them it was. And so I was telling that each one of them, like, hey, have you seen so-and-so spending more money than he usually has, or whatever it was. And then I found out there was another revolutionary student, and he'd also had his money taken. And so both of us were robbed. And so it clearly wasn't either group against the other. It was a third party, which was a landwear person. And so we were working together, even though technically we didn't agree politically. So that was the thing. It's all about making these alliances and these relationships. And then he started talking to me to get me involved in listening to some, new discussions on the theory of the revolution, why it was a thing. And he's like, you don't have to join, but come listen. And so I joined with him to do that because he was helping me find out who stole my money. And so in the course of doing all that, I was able to talk myself out of getting whipped as a symbol because I wasn't involved. And so the landwear people, specifically, I think it was the sergeant, he agreed with me and said, okay, I won't do that unless I'm ordered to. Which was as good as I was going to get, right? So I felt like I accomplished all my objectives. However, other people did their things, I'll put it, way better. They were much better at doing the things that were going to get them points. So one of the things that at the end of the game, it was this crazy battle. The game actually ended early. So what happened was, I think some of the people wanted to get back at the Baron, as an example. And at this point, it had become clear that the Baron was probably doing things for his own self-promotion, and he was pitting people against each other to draw attention away from him, but make excuses for other things that were going to happen. And again, I'm not trying to get too much into the detail of what was going to happen, but at a certain point, a combat broke out, and I was there at the time. So we were in a room where I was meeting, and it was a meeting between some of the loyalist students, some of the revolutionary students, and this one woman. And I still to this day am not clear what her role was. She was played by a young woman, and in real life, she's the sister of one of the guy who was playing the Baron. And she was a revolutionary. I just wasn't clear, like in the game, other than being a revolutionary, what her role was. But she was really great. So she did a lot of really fun role playing things. So we were in this room, and one of the players said, oh, I'm going to go get the Chancellor to come in and have a drink with us and just sit down so we can essentially like air our grievances, or like whatever it was. So the Baron came into the room, but I think I wasn't really clear on what was going on. And so I was a little shocked that he'd shown up. And then when he showed up, the guy who said he invited him to the room made a motion that, like, I'm going to attack this guy and you guys need to attack. And now the Baron couldn't see this guy behind him, but I don't have a great poker face. And when I saw this guy doing that, I was like, that is not why I'm here. And I think the guy playing the Baron saw me, and he's like, hey guys, like, I'm out of here. And so he left. And so then this player that had dragged him in, student B, he's like, nope, I'm going to attack him. And so he went to attack him.
So this giant combat breaks out. Well, giant. There were just a few players involved, as you can see here, but it was really interesting because we were all kind of, like I said, making these alliances together. Now, I knew that two of the characters were revolutionaries, or I guess I should say there were three. There were three revolutionaries, and then there was Student A, played by Baron de Rapp, I mentioned before, from Dungeon Masterpiece. So he was not a revolutionary. He was a loyalist, as was I-ish. I kind of was there and got swept up in this. And it was partly because this guy in the far corner here, Student C, he was the other character who'd had his money stolen. And so he and I had kind of developed this friendship, and which is why I even went to this meeting in the first place, that I knew was sort of a meeting about revolutionary ideas. And I was there, and again, this sort of bloodbath broke out, and it was very quick, but we all had to go up to go stand at Dave Wesely's table, and we hadn't been there the whole game. We'd been all around the room, and really what would happen is, like, the only time you would interact with Dave Wesely is if you had a question about, well, what happens? How do I do this? Or whatever it is. And every once in a while, like at one point I was having a discussion with the Chancellor, and the Chancellor said, can you go take a lap basically around the outskirts, the perimeter of the university, and make sure all the gates are locked and no one's broken, like this kind of thing. And I said, okay, how do I do that? And he said, you need to go ask Dave Wesely, like, what happens when you do that? Which I did. And it turns out all the gates were locked, so it didn't matter. But that was kind of how you used the referee in this case, were for things like that. So this fight broke out, and that's the only time dice came out in this entire game. So, and my character, I didn't fight at all. So and I'm just going to tell you what happened in our game, because every game's going to be different. But basically what happened was Student B attacked and ended up killing. No, he didn't. Student B got killed by the Baron. Okay. And so what had turned out was I was also going along with Student A, because I was like, okay, I think this is a chance to get rid of this corrupt Baron. I knew the Baron was corrupt. And so, but then the Baron ended up killing Student B. And it turned out later, I found out that Student A, and I should say at this point, we all kind of started to come up with names for each other, because we weren't referring to each other as Student A, Student B, So the woman player I told you about that was playing the revolutionary, she called her character Gretchen, and she walked around using the voice from Mean Girls. And it took me a bit to figure out that that's what she was doing, because I've actually never seen that movie. But once I figured it out, I thought it was really funny. But she would call me Gregory, and Student F was, I think, Frank. And so everybody had a name like that, like based on their initials. So anyway, I think Student A was Adam, maybe. So I thought that he was going to attack the Baron because or he was going to protect the Baron. In any event, he ended up turning and changing sides. And I was shocked, because I wasn't expecting it. So I think that he had gone and he was going to try to stop Student B or prevent something from happening. But what he really wanted to do was, he was hoping to kill the Baron and put Student B, and as it turned out was the Baron's son, put him in a position of power. But then once Student B had been killed and there was no longer an option, he went to go ahead and try to kill the Baron. And so this fight broke out, and I was so confused. I wasn't expecting that turn of events. And also I felt like it wasn't really my character's, his position or his background, where he would be in a violent bloodbath to kill the Baron. I thought the Baron was corrupt. I didn't think like murdering him in cold blood was necessarily the way to go about it. But I was there. The Baron ended up getting killed. I think I might be remembering things a little bit differently, but then a fight broke out between Student C and the woman character revolutionary and Student A. And then there was one other person there now that I'm remembering. But as it turned out, everyone started killing each other, and the revolutionaries won the day. So Student C and the woman revolutionary, Gretchen, we'll call her, they were the last two people left. Oh, and my person. And I was left because I actually tried to stop
student A from killing student C because I was like, hey, we made friends, let's just walk away. Like, we don't need to do this. But they decided to go through it anyway. And so I had to duck out of the way. And so the game ended, and Dave Wesley's like, I've never had a game end this way. It's, complete blow. And he's basically said, like, okay, well, at this point, the game's over. Like, the Baron's dead, student B's dead, student A was dead. So let's wrap it up. And so we all kind of gather. So he had to gather. So meanwhile, while this combat's going on, all the other players who weren't involved, they're still off doing their side deals. They were still talking to try to figure out how to, move forward. So Dave Wesley summoned everyone to the table, and we all stood in a big circle around the table. And so he basically said, okay, first off, let's start with the landware, like, who was the French spy? And it turned out that there were multiple spies. The landware person didn't know who the spies were, which I guess is very, very common, that they don't know. And they either say they don't know, which is what happened also in Ben Milton's game. You'll see that in his video. Our person, I think, said the same thing. Like, I don't know. Now, I don't even know if they knew that they were supposed to be French spies in the game. Like, if that was part of their background, it said that they were aware of it, but there were multiples, and they hadn't figured it out. So then he went on to saying, basically, the players vote on who did the best job of achieving their goals. And he broke the goals down into kind of three groups. One was promoting the revolutionary cause, one was promoting the loyalist cause, and one was your self-interest, promoting your self-interest. So I didn't put myself forward for promoting my self-interest because I felt like other people did it way better. So I voted for, certain people, and that was kind of how we wrapped it up. So it was really fun. But like I said, it was very much of like this LARP, or, live action role playing experience. There were no rules for how we could interact with each other. Dave Wesley's primary rule when he runs this game is that you can try anything. It might not work, but you can try to do anything. And that was very clear through how he ran this game, that's what would have happened at the time. So to give perspective, student A was originally played by Dave Arneson. And there was a duel that happened between him and another character in the game. I think it was one of the landware, but I'm not sure. I'm not sure who the duel was with specifically, but that's where the dueling thing came from, where Dave Wesley had to figure out how to roll dice to determine the outcome of these battles. And it's all based on 6-sided dice. So in our game, he gave most of the players were rolling 2-sided dice, or 2 6-sided dice. I don't think that any player got 3 because of the people who were in the room. I think if different people had been there during that fight, some of them are more capable from a combat standpoint, and they might have been able to roll 3d6 as opposed to 2. What I recall from ours is that everybody roughly had the same combat ability. And so we were just rolling 2d6 to determine who was back. And there's no modifier. There's no anything. It's just a straight roll who gets higher. And then that person, gets hit or not. And so that was kind of how the combat happened. But a few things that came out of this that I saw that really kind of helped me to understand how we get from war games to role-playing games, what that genesis was. It's not these like really neat, strict, siloed activities that take place. It's an evolution, and it's all happening at the same time. And you've got people in other parts of the Midwest, mostly Midwest, that are playing similar kind of games as they hear each other talking about these things and some things that they did and what's new and what they're changing. And so, ideas are developing, but there's this evolution from this idea of, again, having your figure representing multiple figures and troops of figures to representing only an individual figure, and then getting rid of the armies entirely and just playing the role of that person in this game. So one of the things that Dave Wesley did when he ran this Braunstein game, it was a dupe. So people came over expecting to play a Napoleonics war game, and he actually had figures laid out. So that it looked like you're going to play this game. But then what he did was, okay, kind of like, before we start, I want to do this kind of pregame thing where we talk about this. And he kind of fooled them because what he called sort of the before the game, the pregame, that actually was the game that he was intending to play. He never intended to use his Napoleonic troops, but he wanted to kind of fool them into thinking that that's what was going to happen because that's what everybody was used to doing back then. But he adds this concept of the referee. He adds this idea that like you can try anything. Anybody can try to do anything, and then the referee will determine whether that's successful or not. He adds the idea of having, dice is not really an idea to like figure out the actions, okay? But having to on the fly figure out that these two characters are going to have a duel and how do I figure out whether that works or not? That was not something that he'd planned for. And so allowing them to do that and then coming up on the fly with a rule of how many dice each should roll to figure out whether that was successful. That's another thing that's added to role-playing games, having that trust in your neutral referee, your neutral arbiter to figure out how to adjudicate a situation and make a ruling and then move on with the game. That's a crucial part of Dungeons and Dragons and all role-playing games as having that option. Now, I know there are role-playing games out there now that are, game masterless. You don't need a game master to play. I've not really played any of those, so I'm not sure where that, I guess it must be cooperative. Everyone just agrees together what the rules should be. But, I still am in this, I guess you'd call it an old school style of play where I like having that dungeon master or that game master, that referee to make those types of decisions independent of playing in the game. But also, having each player have a different goal, have or different multiple goals, having players have those and working towards those by making relationships and alliances and interactions with the other players. That, again, is something that we see coming into role-playing games, having, and sometimes the players make up their own goals, but in this particular case, Dave Wesely was assigning them. So you're getting to that point. And so these are all ideas that we're seeing kind of move into role-playing games. This idea of like there was no winner to that game. So there were players who died. I wouldn't say that they lost because, there were no points that were being awarded. There were people that voted on, who accomplished their goals the best. So I guess in a way you could say that those were the winners of the game, but nobody really looked at it that particular way because you weren't keeping score in that sense. So that kind of zero-sum idea where everybody's winning because we're all participating together and playing this game. And I accomplished all of my goals, so I feel like I won, even though they didn't select me. And again, it's because I didn't promote myself for having done that. So, I felt like I accomplished what I wanted to coming out of that game. So all these are ideas that we see come into the modern idea of role-playing games, and they all started with Braunstein. So that's why now historians can kind of look back, people who study this type of thing, and say Braunstein really was how we got to role-playing games. Now, I am going to talk about in one of my future videos, it might be the next one I do, we'll see, my experiences playing that first Blackmore campaign. So if you've watched the channel, Blackmore derives out of Braunstein. Okay, so Dave Arneson ends up taking over running the Braunstein games and that group, that Minneapolis group, as sort of the referee and the main person, partly because he's hosting. He has a house where they have enough room to play. And so that's part of it. Okay, but not the only reason. He was also good at it. He had skills that he was just naturally suited to run this type of thing. And everybody seemed like they sort of recognized that, even though he was much younger than some of the older players. And then you have some of the older players that have moved on. They've, especially the ones that were really, really interested more in the wargaming aspect, playing Napoleonic miniatures games. Some of them kind of moved on and they kept playing war games, but they didn't get into this new style of game. And so newer players are coming in that are closer to Dave Arneson's age, where there's no sort of looking at him and thinking like, who does this young kid think he is telling us how to play these games when they're older? Because he was quite young at the time when he joined this group. But the other thing that's going to happen is Dave Wesely is going to get called away. As he says, the United States gave him a job opportunity that he couldn't refuse. It was 1970, so we can guess what was going on. So he ends up being in the Army. And so Dave Arneson takes over running these games, and he runs a medieval Braunstein. And I'm going to talk about that again in my next video, but we're going to start to see what was the same and then also what was different. And I was actually quite surprised at, just to give you a little spoiler alert, how much the first Blackmore game, at least according to Bill Hoyt, still involved wargaming aspects that, quite frankly, were not present in the Braunstein game that I played. So I was very, very surprised at that because I was not expecting that. I was expecting this kind of very linear progression of role playing from Braunstein to even more role playing in Blackmore to then where you get to Dungeons and Dragons. And that's not what I saw. And I was quite surprised by that. So I had a very different Blackmore experience than, again, Questing Beast Ben Milton did at his game. His was run by Bob Meyer. Mine was run by Bill Hoyt. And the way that he described his game was totally not the experience that I had. So that being said, I hope that you look forward to that video and in the future so that you can see this. And I'll be continuing this discussion of the games that influenced where we got to with the game of Dungeons and Dragons. So that should be coming up, like I said, pretty much next. And it's also going to cover some of those other topics that I talked about. I might put it, all in the same video. Depends on how long it gets. So thank you again so much for watching. And I would like to encourage you, if you can, stay through the bonus content. I've heard a lot of people like it. So if you don't, I understand that. But at the end, you're going to see some video recommendations of things to watch next. So if you could please check some of those out, I would really appreciate it. Even if you skip through and then just get to that part for the end cards, that would really help me to kind of click and watch one of those videos because it helps the algorithm to understand how sticky my channel is, which is a big deal on the YouTube algorithm phase. So with that, I would like to say thank you so much for watching. Stay safe, happy gaming, and I'll talk to you next time. And now for the bonus content, what I was drinking, what I was listening to, and I made my notes for this video. So I flew back from the convention yesterday on the 29th of April. It was the Monday. So I decided to stay over because I wasn't quite sure when I was going to be done on Sunday. And I didn't want to rush getting to the airport. So I gave myself some time. And as it turns out, that was a really great way I was able to ease into the day. And I took a walk in the morning along the Mississippi, and then I hopped on a flight, came home. But I was working on my notes on the plane. And then I worked on them last night a little bit when I got home. But today is April 30th. So it's International Jazz Day. And it was this morning when I actually coalesced my notes into kind of the format and the order that I was going to do things. I wasn't quite sure how I was going to do this. Originally, I planned to just make one long video talking about the entire convention. I realized that even for me, that would have been too long. So I stuck with Braunstein. And but I wanted to recognize International Jazz Day, which is the last day of Jazz Appreciation Month on April 30th. So as far as drinking, I was drinking this drink here. This is called a Hanky Panky. I'm just going to drop that in there. So a Hanky Panky is a classic cocktail that was created at the Savoy Bar in London. And that happened during the Prohibition era in the United States. So Prohibition started in 1920, and a bunch of bartenders fled from the United States and went to Europe or Cuba to continue practicing their craft. And one of the people ended up writing a cocktail book, very famous book, in 1930, I believe it was, which is called the Savoy Cocktail Book. And his name was Harry Craddock, but this drink predates him. So this drink was created in the 1920s by a woman of the name of Ada Coleman. So she was one of the very few female bartenders at the time, and she ran the bar at the Savoy Hotel. And she created this drink. And the story of the creation of this drink is that a famous actor at the time, and his last name was Hawtrey, I think. I forget his first name, but he came into the bar and asked Ada to make him a drink that had some punch to it. And so she created this drink that is essentially a riff on what's called a Martinez. And a Martinez predates the martini, and it is a mix of gin and what they would call Italian vermouth. So if you ever see that on an old cocktail menu, that means what we would now call sweet vermouth. So French vermouth was what we would call dry, and Italian vermouth was sweet. So a Martinez is a mix of gin and sweet vermouth. The proportions vary depending on the recipe that you see. So she created a Martinez that was equal parts gin and sweet vermouth. And then instead of just adding maraschino liqueur, which was sometimes added to that cocktail to create a Martinez, or adding some bitters, she added Fernet Branca, which you've heard me talk about here before. So a couple bar spoons of Fernet, and it adds that kind of bitterness, and it helps balance the cocktail because honestly, it's way too sweet. If you do half and half gin and sweet vermouth, it's, for me, way too sweet. So adding the Fernet kind of helps dial that down. Now, I made a version closer to what my local bartender does for me because she also hates sweet drinks. So we tried a hanky-panky together years ago. We were trying to figure out, because I'd never had one before. I had all the ingredients. I just never made one. It just kind of came to me at the bar. And she was like, this is going to be terrible. And I was like, let's give it a try. And it was a start, but then she began riffing on it. And so she does a very aggressive proportion for her version, where she does 1.5 ounces of gin, and then she does 1 ounce of sweet vermouth and a little less than 3/4 of an ounce of Fernet. Now, I would not recommend that to anybody who's not used to Fernet because you will hate that drink. The Fernet is just so aggressive in that one. Of course, you all know I love Fernet, so that's how I like to drink it. And we christened it the Cranky Pinky because my bartender can be a little prickly with people. But we did it in a loving way. She thinks it's hilarious. This one's a little closer to the original. I just put in more than 2 bar spoons of Fernet. I think I did about 4. But anyway, that's the Cranky Panky. So, and I'm serving this because the Prohibition era is sort of also the start of the jazz era. Okay. So, I wanted a thematically appropriate cocktail. Plus, I just like it. Yeah. Okay. That hits the spot. Now, what I was listening to, I wanted to get one of the original jazz people. And, there's a lot. There's no like one person that you can point to and say, that's the person that created jazz, despite how many people will try to tell you that there is. However, one of the people that was there, not quite at the beginning, but very close, was Louis Armstrong, Satchmo. It's his nickname. And, my dad loves Louis Armstrong. So I grew up hearing Louis Armstrong mostly on the radio. My dad didn't have a ton of Louis Armstrong records, interestingly enough, but we would, if it ever came on the radio, my dad would make sure to play it. And so I grew up knowing who Louis Armstrong was. And my friend gave me this record for Christmas a number of years ago. But if you see here, this is a live recording of Satchmo, a jazz concert presented at the Pasadena Civic Auditorium. So if you watch the channel enough, I think you know I live in Pasadena. I've been to the Civic Auditorium. So this is a real special one for me. You can see it's very old. It's a lot of ringware on the top. So that's what this is called. This white flex where you can see the outline of where the record is inside. That's called ringware. And again, it's not in great shape, but I wanted to pull this out again because I don't listen to a lot of what people would call Dixieland style jazz. I don't listen to a ton of vocal jazz anymore. I do, just not as often as I listen to instrumental. But Louis Armstrong is such an entertainer, and this is a very fun album to hear him live. And one of the things that I love on this, if you see, it's got, Jack Teagorn on trombone, very famous trombone player. Earl Hines on piano. And then you see here, Velma Middleton on vocals. So he does a few songs here that, again, have some vocals to them. And one of my favorites is this version of Baby, It's Cold Outside. So he's singing with Velma Middleton this song. And everyone knows that song, I think. And it's kind of call and response. And one of the things that Louis does and that only he can do, and he just does it so well. So he's completely improvising the lyrics. So he's changing them around. So she's saying things like, like my mother will start to worry and things like, and then, there's the line about the father where she's like, my father will be waiting at the door, I think, or something like that. And so Louis Armstrong, instead of singing the line that he's supposed to sing that like rhymes and is in cadence, he's just like, oh, he's got to go, like whatever. And then he does these things where, they have this little pattern in the middle of the song where it just goes to instrumental, and the two of them are just like having a conversation. And she's saying that, like, I'd really like to stay, but I sneaked out of the house. And he's like, you did what? And she's like, I sneaked out of the house. He's like, don't ever do that to your mommy and daddy. Like, that's not, you can't do it. He goes,
but since you're here, and he just keeps talking. He's like, you stay here for a little bit longer, a couple more weeks, and then you can go back to your people. And it's really funny. And then there's another part where she says, she's born on the way on the other side of town. And so he says, well, where were you born? And she's like, oh, I'm from in Pasadena. She says she's from South Fair Oaks. Fair Oaks is a big street here. And he's like, no, you can't, that can't be. Because I guess at the time, Fair Oaks was sort of a neighborhood that maybe wasn't quite, maybe there's a little more crime or something like that, right? Whatever. And so it's just this ongoing joke with all these inside jokes. And so you get the impression like he's changing the song every time they visit a new city. He's doing his research to figure out what are the neighborhoods that they're going to mention, that where she's from. And they're just doing this little banter that probably changes every time. And I think it's hilarious. I play this record at Christmas, actually, because that song, a lot of people associate with Christmas, and I just like listening to it. So in any event, give some jazz a try. It doesn't have to be this album. I think you can get this one on Spotify, or I'm certain you could look it up on YouTube. But, I know I talk a lot about jazz. There was a person at the convention that came up and he's like, I always watch your bonus content, even though I'm not a jazz guy, which I felt really good about because, that takes a lot of dedication to go through and watch something that when you're maybe not interested in that. And, I thought that was really neat. And so I told him, I was like, okay, I promise I will start featuring more non-jazz records. And so, but since we're on International Jazz Day, I had to do one last one. I will still do jazz, but I will try to slip in some other non-jazz stuff for folks. Again, the reason I talk about jazz so much is because I figure most of you don't listen to it, and maybe you'll see something, experience that you weren't aware of. All right. So this has been a super long bonus content. So I just once again want to say thank you so much for your support of the channel. And thanks again to everybody who came up to meet me at DaveCon in Minneapolis, whether you had already watched the channel, or some people, because Professor Dungeon Master kept telling people to watch my channel, which I'm super grateful for. And they would come up and say, oh, I just subscribed because he said that, and I'm going to check you out. So thank you so much for your support. And again, there's some other videos here that you can check out. Don't forget to join me on social media, and I will talk to you next time. Cheers.